Welcome to the podcast, "'Tis But a Scratch, Fact and Fiction About the Middle Ages." I'm your host, Professor Richard Abels. Today we'll be talking about how medieval adultery has been presented in modern literature and movies. This is the third of a three-part series about medieval adultery. As with the first two parts, we'll be focusing upon the most famous and most often retold tales of medieval adultery, the stories of Lancelot and Guinevere, and of Tristan and Isolt. And, as with the first two parts, I am delighted to have as my very special guest and co-host the incandescent Larissa Kat Tracy. Kat, I'm so pleased to have you back on the podcast.
I'm delighted to be back. Thank you for welcoming me again to the podcast.
Well, like I said, we're going to talk not about the Middle Ages per se, but about medievalism, how the Middle Ages has been recast by modern authors and by filmmakers. And I think what we should do is we should begin with the modern authors, because that way we can begin in the 19th century.
Absolutely. The 19th century, of course, was very important for the whole development of medievalism.
Let's begin where we left off in our last episode, with the story of Tristan and Isolde. Although the tale of Lancelot and Guinevere is probably better known today, Tristan and Isolde's love affair is the subject of the most culturally significant treatment of medieval adultery in the 19th century. Richard Wagner's opera,
Tristan and Isolde.
Tristan und Isolde. I have to confess, I'm not really an opera fan. I much prefer Broadway musicals and straight plays and movies.
That's fine. And Wagner's operas are fraught in many, many respects, but it becomes a touchstone for cinema.
And despite their medieval settings, Wagner's operas are a bit much for me. It's not because Wagner was associated with Nazis, but because these operas seem to go on forever. This is especially true of Tristan und Isolde, which is nearly 4 hours long and in which nothing happens. It is 4 hours of Tristan and Isolde singing about things that had happened. There's no action.
Right, nothing happens.
In all the acts, they tell what happened.
Right, it's past tense.
Yeah,
it's not the present tense.
It's not the present tense. It's a really frustrating work for that, but the music is... Well, it's transformative music.
And it's evocative, and that's why John Borman used it for Excalibur.
What Wagner did in Tristan and Isolde was he took the story, and he basically took it from Gottfried of Strassburg, who had only recently been translated into modern German, and he married that story to the philosophy of author Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer advanced a Buddhist-like philosophy that cast life as filled with suffering and the denial of the will to live as the only salvation from suffering. And he was taking a break when he was doing this from finishing up the Ring cycle.
Mhm.
So this was sort of like his sabbatical from the ring cycle. He was also had to flee from Germany because he was engaged in revolutionary activities and took refuge in Zurich, where he met Otto and Matilda Wesendonck at a concert he conducted. Both loved Wagner's music and shared with him the conviction that he was a genius. Otto became Wagner's financial patron, and Matilda became something more than that. Otto set Wagner up in a cottage on Lake Lucerne.
Right,
Yes.
and they live near him.
Right
they live next
to him.
door.
Yes. There, Wagner began to meet regularly with Matilda while her husband worked in Zurich. At the very least, they engaged in a passionate emotional affair. Whether it became physical is uncertain. And something tells me you're skeptical. You're in good company, because Wagner's wife Minna and Matilda's husband Otto were equally skeptical. When Minna joined her husband in Switzerland in 1858, she was put off by the attention that Wagner was paying toward his beautiful young neighbor. Her suspicions were confirmed when she intercepted a romantic letter from Wagner to Matilda. Distraught, Minna confronted her husband. Wagner responded first by sending Minna to a spa to recuperate, as she, and it's hard to say this without irony, had a heart condition, and then back to Dresden to stay with her family. Before she left for Dresden, Minna wrote to Matilda, quote, "I must tell you with a bleeding heart that you have succeeded in separating my husband from me after nearly 22 years of marriage. May this noble deed contribute to your peace of mind, to your happiness." Apparently it didn't. Matilda seems to have believed that Wagner had a understanding with his wife. He didn't. Matilda's husband, Otto, had his suspicions as well, and in 1858 he took Matilda to Italy, apparently to get her away from Wagner. Wagner himself went to Italy, but he went to Venice and he went alone, where he continued working on Tristan. Fearing that the Venetian authorities would extradite him to Saxony, Wagner returned to Lake Lucerne, where he completed the opera in August of 1859. But it wasn't until 6 years later that the opera received its premiere. The score was so innovative and the staging so expensive that it was widely considered unperformable. The Vienna Court Opera gave it a try and staged 77 rehearsals of Tristan between 1862 and 1864 before finally giving up. But King Ludwig of Bavaria, who admired Wagner's music and became his patron, came to the rescue, and the opera finally premiered in Munich in 1865. Appropriately, at least in a Loesch manner, the conductor was Hans von Berlow, with whose wife, Cosima, Wagner was then having an intense adulterous affair that eventually led to a double divorce and Wagner's second marriage. It's perhaps not a coincidence that Wagner's Tristan und Isolde is an opera celebrating adulterous passion that was conceived and first performed while the composer himself was engaged in adultery. Wagner's Tristan und Isolde is medievalism rather than medieval. Wagner uses a medieval tale to make a very unmedieval point. In the medieval romances about Lancelot and Guinevere and Tristan and Iseult is the sense of conflict between duty and love, duty and desire. With Wagner, there really is no sense of conflict. If anything, what Wagner really is interested in is the relationship between transcendent love and death.
Right.
The Liebestod is foreshadowed from the very beginning of Wagner. Wagner has the potion, but when they take the potion in Act 1 of Wagner, what they think they're taking is a poison. And it's not so much that the potion creates the love, it allows them, as they think they're dying, to declare the love that they already have for one another. There's a wonderful movie, Almost Famous, about a rock band. And there's a wonderful scene in that movie where the plane that they're flying on looks like it's about to crash, and everyone tells everyone else what they really think about each other,
That's right.
including the guy who just declares that he's gay. And unfortunately, the plane doesn't.
Well, I mean, I guess fortunately or unfortunately, but the point is now that they're safe, they all look at each other and now have to reconcile with those truths that they told. Absolutely.
And in this case, the lovers have declared themselves, because for Wagner, it's transcendent love which cannot exist in this plane.
Right. And so it has to have the air of death over it all the time.
Because Schopenhauer's shadow falls over Wagner's work, and Schopenhauer was basically taking Buddhist thought and transferring it to Germany, so that what you have is the sense that all of life is suffering. How do you escape it? You escape it through life, and in the case of Tristan and Isolde, they escape it through a passion which is so great it can't be contained in this life.
In this life. And it has to culminate in that final death. Absolutely.
And so there's no tragedy.
No, because it's going to happen. Yes.
And it's a fulfillment. Right. Death becomes a fulfillment rather than a punishment and a penalty for adultery.
Right.
In other words, Tristan is an opera in which the perfection, the consummation of the love is going to be the death of the two lovers, that they can then be together, freed from the conventions of the world, just as Wagner wanted to be freed from the social conventions of the world.
But that's an interesting point, because that idea of the buildup of love plays a huge part in the popular culture iterations of both the Lancelot and Guinevere and the Tristan and Isolde stories, especially when you get into film, because that dramatic tension is are they really going to engage in adultery or not, and how much of that is love that starts before the potion, what part does it play? And when you get into cinema, the way that adultery is portrayed, particularly in those two storylines, is always about, we have to resist. We can't. Whoa, but we must. Oh no, we did. Now what?
I totally agree that will they or won't they? Oh no, they did. Now what? Is the central dilemma in the medieval movies about adultery. It seems to me to be less so with Wagner. The entire opera is about sensual, passionate love. Of course they did it. The opera not only presented staging and musical challenges, but also a challenge to conventional Christian morality. The pianist and composer Clara Schumann recognized this and was repulsed by it. After hearing Tristan and Isolde in 1875 in Munich, she wrote in her diary, quote, "It was the most repulsive thing I have ever seen or heard in my life. To be forced to see and listen to such sexual frenzy the whole evening, in which every feeling of decency is violated, and by which not just the public, but even musicians seem to be enchanted, that is the saddest thing I have experienced in my entire artistic life." Wagner meant his music to convey unquenched desire. This was Wagner's vision from the inception of Tristan and Isolde. In 1854, when he was first conceiving the project, he wrote a letter to Franz Liszt in which he explained his purpose. Quote, "As I have never in life felt the real bliss of love, I must erect a monument to the most beautiful of all my dreams, in which from beginning to end, that love shall be thoroughly satiated. I have in my head Tristan and Isolde, the simplest but most full-blooded musical conception. With the black flag which floats at the end of it, I shall cover myself to die." End quote. Wagner's comment about never having felt the real bliss of love may be his justification for his womanizing. I do wonder, however, whether Liszt remembered this line when he learned of Wagner's affair with his then married daughter Cosima and their subsequent marriage. While Wagner's Tristan and Isolde is arguably the most significant contribution to Arthuriana in the 19th century, Britain was the home of literary treatments of Arthurian legends, which I guess is not really all that surprising. The catalyst for this was the publication of 3 new editions of Sir Thomas Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur in 1816 and 1817 after a nearly 2-century hiatus. Malory's book hadn't been lost, but it had fallen out of fashion. The Romanticism movement of the late 18th and early 19th century revived interest in the Middle Ages, and Malory provided English authors with a treasure trove of medieval stories to draw upon, including, of course, the tales of Lancelot and Guinevere and of Tristram, the name preferred by the English, and Isolt. For Victorian authors, these stories about the adulterous passions of noble knights and beautiful queens presented a dilemma.
Yeah, absolutely. And what takes off in the reign of Victoria is not just this sense of a medieval past that existed in the decaying ruins. You see that in early Gothic texts that talk about the medieval past as some dark, dingy place where you might have vampires, you might have creeping, crawling things, or dead women hanging out in dungeons.
Gothic, yes.
Absolutely. And the earliest Gothic novels that start at the end of the 18th century into the early Romantic period, they certainly established their own sense of medievalism. And of course, Sir Walter Scott, very famously, before Victoria, is writing his own interpretation of how he saw the Middle Ages. So Sir Walter Scott had a very profound effect on the 19th century view of the Middle Ages.
He still has an effect upon it. Ivanhoe is one of the most popular visions of the Middle Ages.
Which is unfortunate because there's an awful lot wrong with
Almost everything.
Almost everything. But of course, if you live in Richmond, Virginia, as I used to, there's a reason it's called Midlothian and Robin Hood Road. And that's because it's inspired by these authors like Sir Walter Scott. And
what we have in the 19th century is we have this focus upon King Arthur.
Yes.
And Arthur becomes the subject of a series of poems, many poems, and paintings.
Yes.
By the pre-Raphaelites.
Yeah, who romanticize this whole idea of the Arthurian world. And very often, the pre-Raphaelite painters are working off of one moment, or one scene, or one little tiny episode that catches the imagination. Some of the most popular paintings are ones like the Waterhouse's The Lady of Shalott.
Yes.
Well, the Lady of Shalott in the medieval text is very different than she is in the Victorian imagination.
And what you have, in fact, because of this emphasis upon Arthur, you have both, on one hand, this cult of chivalry, but on the other hand, you have some moral issues.
One or two
moral issues. Among them is adultery. And it creates, in fact, a creative rift between some of the authors. On one side, we're going to see...
With Tennyson.
And on the other side, we have Algernon Swinburne.
Oh, right.
Yes. Very different takes. And somewhere standing in the middle between this, we have William Morris.
Yes.
And maybe Matthew Arnold.
And what happens is the idea of Arthur takes on a life of its own. After you end up with Tennyson and Arnold and Morris and Swinburne, then you get into the 20th century as well with T.E. White and other imaginings of the Arthurian story. But really, 19th century medievalism and 19th century Arthurianism is quite something to behold.
It is quite something. Maybe what we should do is start with the most popular work on Arthur in the 19th century, which is Tennyson's
Idylls of the King.
Or, if you're a Brit, the Idylls of the King. Yes. So let's start with that. And the Idylls of the King focuses upon the stories of Lancelot and focuses upon the story of Tristram. in separate idols.
Yes. And of course, the way that Tennyson views the entire Arthurian court is colored by his devotion and affection for Prince Albert, who had just died. So he starts the idols in the mid-18th century, and he writes it and keeps writing it for about 30 years.
Yeah. The first idol was published by coincidence the same year that Wagner completed Tristan, and that was 1859. And the final one was published in 1885. His take, it's really interesting because I was reading this again, and his take on the Lancelot story appears in 3 of the idols: The Marriage of Geraint, Lancelot and Elaine, and Guinevere. And Tennyson's caught in a real problem. He wants Lancelot to be a hero.
Yes.
Lancelot is the exemplar of chivalry.
Yes.
But Tennyson wants all of the poems to focus upon Arthur, and you have this real issue. Lancelot, the exemplar of chivalry, is engaged in an adulterous relationship with Guinevere.
Absolutely. And of course, his dedication to presenting Arthur as this ideal king who is just beset by tragedy and who's just, his kingdom is torn apart almost through no fault of his own, is really the touch point for a lot of later films and adaptations. Now, his dedication to the idols of the king sets up Lancelot as an ideal, but he actually compares Prince Albert, who lately died, to Lancelot with this idea that Victoria and England itself is almost Arthur. And so Albert was the perfect husband, the perfect consort, because Parliament wouldn't let him be king.
Yes.
And so Victoria almost takes on the form of Arthur in that scenario.
Guinevere is not treated well.
No, she's not.
But she is given a explanation of why she was vulnerable. And let me read a little bit of this because it's really so good. She, Guinevere, broke into a little scornful laugh. Arthur, my lord, Arthur the faultless king, that passionate perfection, my good lord, but who can gaze upon the sun in heaven? He never spake word of reproach to me. He never had a glimpse of mine untruth. He cares not for me, only here today there gleamed a vague suspicion in his eyes. Some meddling rogue has tampered with him, else wrapped in this fancy of his table round, and swearing men to vows impossible, to make them like himself. But friend to me, he is all fault, who hath no fault at all. For who loves me must have a touch of earth. The low sun makes the color. I am yours, not Arthur's, as you know, saved by the bond, and therefore hear my words, go to the jousts. And then she goes on to Lancelot. And Arthur's flaw is perfection.
Yes. And in this particular instance, her comments are a response to Lancelot reading her looks.
Yes.
And saying that he won't go to the joust because an old ancient wound is troubling him. And she's sick at home in bed. Lancelot's there with Arthur. Arthur goes to her and she's looking longingly at Lancelot. In fact, he says specifically, then we will miss, he answered, the great deeds of Lancelot and his prowess in the lists, a sight ye love to look on. And the queen lifted her eyes, and they dwelt languidly on Lancelot, where he stood beside the king. He, thinking that he read her meaning there, as stay with me, I am sick, my love is more than many diamonds, yielded, and a heart love loyal to the least wish of the queen, however much he yearned to make complete the tale of diamonds for his destined boon, urged him to speak against the truth and say, Sir King, mine ancient wound is hardly whole, and lets me from the saddle. And the king glanced first at him, then her, and went his way. Now, Lancelot thinks she's entreating him with her eyes to stay because she's sick, and so he lies.
Yes.
And then he's really annoyed that he's lied because Guinevere says, you can't avoid the joust, you have to go, because people are talking. And the tittle-tattle has already started. And, of course, Lancelot says, well, what would you have me do? And that's when she devises the scheme that he should show up at the joust in disguise.
Always in disguise.
Always in disguise. And, of course, she gets around his lie to Arthur about his old wound later because she has to tell Arthur, oh, well, he was worried that people would throw the joust if they knew it was him. So he's really just doing it to test himself and Arthur. He's doing it to glorify you, Arthur.
And we have here deceit upon deceit, disloyalty.
Wicked webs we weave.
And what's interesting to me is that Tennyson was drawing upon Malory, and Malory had given a good out.
Yes, he did. Because Malory very famously
is really
says,
coy. He's really coy about it. Malory's French sources, in particular the 13th century Lancelot from the Vulgate cycle, are explicit about Lancelot's sexual liaisons with Guinevere. Malory, in contrast, is reticent to the point of coyness. At one point in Book 7, Malory's version of Chrétien de Troyes' The Knight of the Cart, Malory writes, quote, "So to pass upon this tale, so Lancelot went to bed with the queen, and took no force of his hurt hand, but took his pleasance and his liking until it was the dawning of the day, for wit you well he slept not, but watched." End quote. Well, took his pleasance and his liking sounds sexual, but is bookended by the observations about Lancelot's hurt hand and about him having spent the whole night watchful. Malory foresaw the objection that if a man and a woman in love lay together throughout the night, they must have engaged in sex, by beginning the story with the assertion that love today is not as it once had been in nobler days. Quote, "But nowadays men cannot love 7 nights, but they must have all their desires. This is no stability. But the old love was not so, for men and women could love together 7 years, and no lecherous lusts were betwixt them. And then was love truth and faithfulness, and so in like wise was used such love in King Arthur's days." In those days, you could have spent years just longing for one another without
ever doing it.
Alfred Lord Tennyson, for one, wasn't persuaded by Malory's special pleading. He wasn't happy about it, but he had to acknowledge that his paragon of chivalry, Lancelot, was having a sexual affair with the wife of his ideal king. And adultery had consequences. In fact, the overall theme of the Idylls is the deterioration of King Arthur's noble ideal of chivalry because of the sin of adultery. Tennyson grants Guinevere the self-knowledge of the corrupting and corrosive influence that her adultery has upon the kingdom, leading to its eventual destruction. Quote, "She dreamed an awful dream, for then she seemed to stand on some vast plain before a setting sun, and from the sun there swiftly made at her a ghastly something, and its shadow flew before it till it touched her, and she turned, when lo, her own, that broadening from her feet and blackening, swallowed all the land, and in it far cities burnt." Dr. Susan Mooney points out in a recent publication that when Tennyson began writing The Idylls of the King in 1857, there was growing public concern about female immorality expressed in parliamentary debates and in newspapers. Among the very worst of these immoral activities was adultery. Quote, "Posing a threat to society and to a woman's immediate family, middle-class female adultery was deemed particularly heinous." End quote. This was the cultural context for the Arthurian writings of Tennyson and his contemporaries. The stories of Lancelot and Guinevere and of Tristram and Isolde played to the anxieties of a reading public that was already concerned about the social deterioration caused by adultery, in particular female adultery. Tennyson couldn't excuse Lancelot entirely, but he placed the burden of blame on the temptress Guinevere. Tennyson divided his female characters into good women and harlots. Enid and Elaine represented the former, and Vivian and Guinevere the latter.
Yes.
And as I said before, Guinevere's justification in the Idylls for her adulterous relationship with Lancelot is that Arthur is just too perfect, too noble, too unapproachable. He lives in an ivory tower of ideals. He doesn't really love her. He loves only his principles. And she, as a woman, needs a touch of the earth in a lover.
And I mean, and his view of Guinevere as this woman who needs some earth in her love, who needs somebody who actually, values her as a woman, has passion, and just cannot be loved by this perfect king, actually doesn't ring true, because Lancelot himself is almost perfect. Lancelot is even more perfect than Arthur. So Guinevere's argument seems very specious.
Yes, she's blinded by her passion.
Yes.
And Arthur is not, it turns out, cold and distant. Arthur is hurt by the betrayal. We discover that in the Idyll of Guinevere. Arthur, now fully aware of Guinevere's betrayal and discovering that she has left Lancelot and retired to an abbey, goes to Almesbury to confront her before he returns to England to fight his nephew Modred for the throne. And yes, his name in Tennyson's Idylls is Modred, not Mordred, and he is a nephew and not a bastard son of Arthur. It would be inconceivable for Tennyson's Arthur to father a bastard son, let alone on a half-sister. Guinevere in the abbey is already riven with guilt and grief. A clueless novice who doesn't know that she's addressing the queen assures her that whatever the cause of her grief, it cannot match that of the king who must defend his realm against the traitor Modred and deal with the treachery of a wicked, sinful queen. Quote, "Yea," said the maid, "this is all women's grief, that she is woman whose disloyal life hath wrought confusion in the Table Round which good King Arthur founded years ago, ere the coming of the sinful queen." Now completely distraught by the novice's unwitting barbs, Guinevere learns that Arthur has arrived at the abbey to confront her. She groveled before him with her face against the floor, and Arthur, in a long monologue, begins by telling her that, quote, "The children born of thee are sword and fire, red ruin, and the breaking up of laws." And after explaining the ideal that he tried to create and uphold with the Round Table, Arthur says, quote, "Then came thy shameful sin with Lancelot, then came the sin of Tristram and Isolde, then others following these my mightiest knights, and drawing foul examples from fairer names, sinned also, till the loathsome opposite of all my heart had destined did obtain." This is what Guinevere expected and what she believes she deserves, but Arthur now shows his true nobility of soul. Although as king, he is duty-bound to leave her to her shame. He nonetheless assures her that he, as a man, still loves her. He tells her that he did not come to curse her, but to forgive her. He forgives her and departs before Guinevere can say even farewell.
Right. And he forgives her because, in many respects, Arthur is that good.
Yes.
And he is more perfect than she knows, but that's because he recognizes her flaws and still accepts her.
And that allows her to embrace redemption.
Yes.
But Guinevere is transformed by Arthur's forgiveness. She recognizes for the first time that Arthur, not Lancelot, was the one truly worthy of her love. Quote, "I thought I could not breathe in that fine air, that pure severity of perfect light. I yearned for warmth and color, which I found in Lancelot. Now I see thee, what thou art. Thou art the highest and most human too, not Lancelot, nor another." Guinevere embraces the life of a nun in hope that, by doing good, quote, "that in mine own heart I can live down sin and be his mate hereafter in the heavens," before high God.
But of course, the fact that she's taken refuge in a nunnery
Yes.
is part of that shutting herself away from the world and saying, okay, I'm not going, it's kind of an atonement though, but it is also a little bit of a cop-out.
Yes.
Well, and what's so interesting then for Guinevere and Tennyson is her sense of atonement and her need for redemption from Arthur. And also, to a certain extent, recognizing what she's done and recognizing how she's hurt Arthur. And we get more sense of humanity from Arthur in that final idyll than we have through any of the rest of the text. Because through a lot of the text, much like in Malory, he doesn't care that much about Guinevere so much as he cares about the fellowship.
Yes.
And this is what Guinevere's channeling. She's saying, he doesn't care about me. He cares about everybody else and all of his knights. I am not that important to him. But it turns out she was wrong.
Absolutely. Absolutely. If Tennyson was disappointed by Lancelot's one great flaw and disapproving of Guinevere's infidelity, he was flat out scathing about Tristram and Isolde's adulterous affair. Tennyson deals with Tristram and Isolde in a late idyll he entitled The Last Tournament. This is the most bitter of the idylls. Arthur's knights have begun to doubt the ideals of the Round Table. The backstory has Arthur pursuing a rogue called the Red Knight, who in mockery of Arthur's chivalry has created the Round Table in the north, a fellowship of knights devoted to crime and wickedness. The tournament of the title is hosted by Arthur to give away a ruby necklace found around the neck of an abandoned baby who died while in Guinevere's care. Arthur has Lancelot preside over the tournament, which degenerates into brawls and cheating of all kinds. Lancelot observes all of this as a bystander, but it is when Sir Tristram enters the lists and many knights ride off the field rather than face him, thus dishonoring the ladies whose colors they wear, that Lancelot laments, quote, "The glory of our Round Table is no more." Sir Tristram of the Woods emerges as the victor. Tennyson's Tristram has prowess of arms, but is lacking in courtesy. He mocks the other knights. Lancelot, aware of Tristram's adulteries, gives him the ruby, but asks, quote, "Hast thou won? Art thou the purest brother?" End quote. Tristram responds by alluding to Lancelot's own adultery with Guinevere. He leaves the tournament with an insult to the ladies present, leading to some murmuring, quote, "All courtesy is dead. The glory of our Round Table is no more." Even Tristram's vaunted skill with the harp is criticized by Tennyson. The king's fool, the dwarf Dagonet, refuses to dance to Tristram's twanging, the word used by Tennyson, and when challenged by Tristram, tells him that he plays broken music. Quote, "Good now, what music have I broken, fool?" And little Dagonet skipping. Author the king's, for when thou playest that air with Queen Isolt, thou makest broken music with thy bride, her daintier namesake down in Brittany, and so thou breakest Arthur's music too. End quote. This leads to Tristram riding to see Queen Isolt, Mark's wife. He has since been married to the other Isolt, Isolt of the White Hands in Brittany, but as Tennyson puts it, quote, "He loved her also, wedded easily, but left her all as easily." Tennyson's Tristram is the inversion of Gottfried of Strassburg's model of courtesy. He has the prowess of a great knight, but the manners of Sir Kay. His adultery is less about a passionate love affair than about desire and opportunity. Tristram is a cad. That's all. He's a cad. He's interested in sex. He's sensual. And what I love about Isolde is Isolde's attraction to Tristram is largely because he's not Mark.
Right.
Mark is a complete worthless human being.
But Tristan is good looking. He is a valiant knight. He is a cad. And there are a few cads in the Idols of the King.
Yeah.
But yeah, Tristan most definitely in this whole last tournament, I don't see the appeal.
No, I don't see the appeal either. And he's not quite sure if he wants to go see her or not, because as far as he's concerned, it's over. But if she's still available,
why
what
not?
the hell?
It's fine. It's convenient. It's an act of convenience.
Yeah, I like the karma that he gets. He ends up getting killed by Mark at the end because he's there.
Because he deserves it. And that's a complete difference from all of the other variations of Tristan. Tristan and Isolde, whether their love was before the potion, because of the potion, or regardless of the potion, in most of those cases, Tristan and Isolde are sympathetic to a certain extent. The difficulty comes where you have Mark as equally good, and you have a repeat of that triangular structure that you sometimes see in the Lancelot.
Which makes it a lot more interesting.
It does, because it's more sympathetic. I mean, it's easy to say, all right, adultery's fine if the other person's a jerk.
And you can't get a divorce.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a totally different thing when you have people who are caught up in love and passion that isn't just singular. And this is one of the things that Tennyson does. The love is always singular. The fact that Guinevere is willing to just say, Arthur doesn't love me at all. He's too perfect. I need earth. I need dirt in my... And we're looking at Lancelot, the shiniest and brightest of the knights in shining armor, going, that's not Lancelot. I wouldn't see Lancelot as earthy. I mean, just consider the Excalibur version of him. He shines to the point where you need sunglasses. But Tristan's portrayal is so flawed that it's hard to sympathize with them at all.
Oh, I don't think he wants you to sympathize with either of them. 11 years later, the decadent aesthete Algernon Swinburne, who one Victorian critic dubbed the libidinous laureate of satyrs, responded to Tennyson's portrayal of Tristram and Isolde with the poem Tristram of Lyonesse. This poem is long and, unlike Tennyson's, covers the entire tale from beginning to end. In doing so, Swinburne claimed that he was faithfully following the medieval sources.
He swears.
But it really doesn't strike me as being all that medieval. Rather, it should be read as a product of the late 19th century British aesthetic movement. Swinburne is writing a poem that is art for art's sake, about beautiful people who should love each other passionately and sensually because they are beautiful people. Theirs is a sensual love which should be celebrated for its sensuality. What it is an in-your-face to Tennyson. It appears that the last tournament was written in response to news that Tennyson had received that Swinburne was engaged in writing a major poem about Tristram and Iseult. And so he was going to beat him
rivalry. To it. It's interesting to think about the way that the Arthurian variants and episodes make their way into medievalisms as early as the 16th century. Because honestly, the first Arthurian medievalism is The Faerie Queen by Spenser.
Yes.
And in that mode, Arthur's a template. Everybody knows the characters. So you can have him flit through the background and carry on with your main story, and he becomes an important touchstone for facets of English identity.
Absolutely. William Morris, part of the pre-Raphaelite, his defense of Guinevere is fascinating. In 1857, when he composed the poem, William Morris was just 23 years old. This was the same year that Tennyson, whom Morris admired, began writing the Idylls. Their takes on Guinevere couldn't be more different. In place of Tennyson's temptress and harlot, redeemed by Arthur's unmerited forgiveness, Morris gives us a self-assured Guinevere whose only shame is her lack of the expected shame. Morris imagines how Guinevere might have defended herself in her trial for adultery, and her defense is, frankly, problematic.
Right.
Although Guinevere admits only to a single kiss, she freely describes her growing passion for Lancelot, comparing it to the changing seasons, almost as if she had in mind Lerner and Lowe's song, If Ever Should I Leave You, from Camelot. In contrast, Guinevere presents her marriage to Arthur as political and says that she was brought to that marriage by, quote, Arthur's great name and his little love, end quote. Throughout, she alternates between denying the accusation and tacitly admitting it. Morris refrains from characterizing Guinevere as morally wrong. In fact, In fact, Guinevere doesn't engage with any of the moral questions about adultery at all. Instead, her defense is a question of who knows what is right, who knows what is wrong. When you're choosing cloth and you see a beautiful blue cloth and a beautiful red cloth, and you know that one is heavenly and the other is devilish, but you don't know which is which, and you just happen to choose the wrong cloth. What is the fault in that?
Right.
It's not a great defense, actually.
Well, it's not. But what Morris does, and I mean, I think you can see this in Morris's artwork and in his rendition of his view of the Middle Ages too, is he's much more interested in a sense of personality.
Yes, which was an attribute of the pre-Raphaelite movement as a whole.
And the capacity for people to maybe not be all good, maybe not be all bad, maybe be a little bit in the middle. And Tennyson's outburst that he gives Guinevere, because you could argue that's her voice, because she speaks, even if she's not sympathetic, but her whole outburst is ridiculous in light of everything else. And, Swinburne then takes the other side of that. But Morris is looking for middle ground, saying, you know what? Sometimes people marry because they have to. And that's a reality of the Middle Ages as well, where you have political marriages. And at the end of the day, in the medieval text, Guinevere's marriage to Arthur is political.
It is.
It's not one based on... And every interpretation of that story as love at first sight or this idealistic, purist love is where you get into problems with Tennyson and the Victorians. Because how do you reconcile the two? Well, let's look at the reality. Maybe her husband was fine, but she just wasn't in love with him because it was a political marriage.
And it's not a defense that would win an acquittal.
Right.
Frankly, when I read the poem, I came away confused by Morris's intentions. But I think that Susan Mooney, in her article, Defending the Indefensible, love that title, Morris, Tennyson, and Arthur's Adulterous Queen, got it right. Morris meant the poem to be subversive. This was an age which gave a pass to men who committed adultery, since it was their nature to have strong and sometimes uncontrollable sex drives. Women, however, were not given the same pass. An adulterous woman was an unnatural and sinful creature. Morris's poem radically argues that desire is as natural a part of women's nature as it is men's, and that for true relations to exist, this desire should be unfettered. Quote, Tennyson upheld social norms and expectations, while Morris radically undermined the tropes on which the idea of the immoral woman depended. Rather than arguing for her innocence or guilt, Morris asks us to make a paradigm shift in thinking about morality. He disregards the relevance of fidelity or duty to Arthur, focusing instead on Guinevere's faithfulness to her true self and to love. End quote. The defense of Guinevere is not great literature, as the Idylls arguably are, but is interesting in its challenge to conventional Victorian sexual morality.
Yeah.
I'm glad that you brought up that William Morris wasn't only an author, but he was also an artist. And as an artist, he was responsible for another popular culture adaptation of the Tristan story, the Tristram and Isolde stained glass window panels. These were 13 small stained glass windows produced in 1862 by William Morris and Company. He was also a manufacturer. They followed an overall design by Morris. The individual panels were designed by 6 pre-Raphaelite artists, one of whom was Morris himself. The presentation of the lovers and their tragic story is sympathetic and close in spirit to Swinburne's retelling of the legend. Okay, there is an American version of the Swinburne, and that is in 1927. Edwin Arlington Robinson, who once was very famous.
He wrote Richard Cory.
Yes, Richard Cory, which may be his only poem that is still read today. But in the 1920s, when poetry was really popular, Robinson was very famous.
Yes.
And was 1927, he wrote Tristram, which was not only a bestseller, but won the Pulitzer in 19... And what this does is it's, again, the story, and the love is a transcendent love. So we don't have the tragedy of death in this one, because they have lived a life which is fuller than others have lived.
Because they love.
Because they loved. Robinson's poem shares the sensibility not only of Swinburne, but also of Wagner, whose opera Tristan and Isolde Robinson regarded as the pinnacle of Wagner's musical genius. Probably the most famous treatment of the Arthurian legend in 20th century literature is T.H. White's.
Which I've never read.
Which you've never read.
I admit it. I've never read it.
Kat, we've talked about this, and I know that the first book of The Once and Future King, The Sword and the Stone, which began as a children's story, put you off. But I think you might be impressed by the final two books of this composite novel, The Ill-Made Knight and The Candle in the Wind. The Once and Future King remains my wife Ellen's favorite novel. I'm not as enamored with T.H. White, frankly, as I was when I first read him in high school, but I still find his treatment of Lancelot and Guinevere's Adultery to be the most sensitive, nuanced, compassionate, and tragic treatment of that story in modern literature. As we are running long and Ellen, Jenny Paxton, and I discuss White's novel in an earlier episode of the podcast, I think we'll move on to some other 20th century novels that deal with medieval adultery. But if you haven't listened to the episode about King Arthur in literature and popular culture, you might want to give it a try. Before we turn to these other works, I thought I would share with our listeners something I learned while preparing for this episode about the Lerner and Loewe musical based on The Once and Future King, Camelot.
If ever I would leave you, how could it be in springtime, knowing how in spring I'm bewitched by you so? Summer, winter, or fall, no, never could I leave you at
all. As I was preparing this episode, I was thinking about Camelot, which is the musical based upon The Once and Future King that focuses upon Lancelot and Guinevere. And I kept on trying to remember whether they actually consummate their affair in the show. They didn't.
No.
In 1960...
You couldn't.
No, actually, you could, but
okay.
J. Allen Lerner, who not only wrote the lyrics, but also wrote the book for the show. In his first draft, and in the show's early out-of-town performances, they consummated. They had sex. But then, having Julie Andrews in the lead...
Oh, you couldn't.
You can't have Julie Andrews committing adultery.
No. Oh, gosh. That's so funny.
So he cut it out. But when they made the movie of it in 1966, because he also wrote the screenplay,
right.
He put it back in.
Okay.
And when they revived the show in 1980, they're having sex.
I seem to remember that because I saw it in the mid-'80s at Wolf Trap up in Northern Virginia.
And they were having sex.
I remember that. I mean, I was probably 12, but I remember that.
And there is a final irony to this whole story which just blows my mind. While Alan J. Lerner couldn't conceive of an audience accepting Julie Andrews as engaging in adultery, Julie Andrews herself, during the run of the show, was seriously contemplating having an affair with Richard Burton. The two of them were then married to other people, but she found him incredibly attractive. She confessed to a journalist in an interview, quote, He was unbelievably attractive. He just oozed charisma. I'm so glad he didn't make any kind of a pass at me for many, many months. I was happily married, and I hope I would have been a good girl, but I couldn't be sure he was that attractive." End quote. But when Burton finally did make a pass, Andrews was the good girl. Quote, "There came a day when Richard did, in his way, make a sort of pass, and I got angry that he did it. I have to admit that Mary Poppins let fly with an Anglo-Saxon 4-letter word. I told him where to go and how to get there." End quote. She added that it resulted in another 2 bad performances. I love because it shows you the tension here. And as long as conventional morality decrees that a marriage be monogamous, there will be these tensions. For Julie Andrews in 1960, the tension arose from a conflict between the moral expectation of marital fidelity and physical desire, although for Burton and many other Hollywood stars of the 60s, it doesn't seem to have been all that much of a problem. The tension between marital fidelity and extramarital desire was a lot more serious problem in the medieval world that Andrews, Burton, and Goulet were occupying in the show they were performing.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, because that is the tension. And if you're going to have a story about an idealized king or even an idealized lifestyle or code of honor, you can't deal with the adultery very well. I mean, what do you do with that? It's treason. We discussed that in the other episodes. Adultery, the adultery between Lancelot and Guinevere is treason. And they're wrong. There's almost no way else around it in medieval texts.
With Tristan, at least you have the potion.
That's true, if you want to use it.
If you want to use it. And that brings me to 1971 and a book that I didn't read, but I've read about. And that's Rosemary Sutcliffe's Tristan and Isolde. Now, this was written as a young adult's novel.
Yeah, Rosemary Sutcliffe did that with a number of medieval texts.
1972, it was runner-up for the Carnegie Award.
Okay.
And so what makes it really interesting is, one, it follows Guinevere very closely.
Yeah.
Very closely. Except for one really significant change. She cuts out the potion. Because she said psychologically it makes no sense.
Right.
And if it makes no sense to her, she can't write about it. And she put in the preface, everybody's expecting the potion.
There's no potion.
There's no potion. They're just in love.
Right.
Which means there is no excuse for this.
Right.
And not only do you have the adultery between Tristan and Isolt in this, Tristan dies and she's drawing upon Eilhart's version. Tristan dies while he is helping his friend and brother-in-law, Kenahidin, commit adultery with some other man's wife. The husband breaks in, discovers them, and in the fight that follows,
he kills Tristan.
Kenahidin is killed, and Tristan is mortally wounded before he kills the husband.
Okay.
So you have, in a young adult's novel, unapologetically, our hero committing adultery and abetting his friend to commit adultery.
And dying in the process.
Yeah. I'm not sure that Sutcliffe thought about this consciously, but an unexpurgated version of the Tristan and Isolde story for young adults would have been inconceivable for the mainstream Victorian cultural sensibility. But in the 1970s, it fit in with the sexual revolution. I'd be surprised, though, to find it on the shelves of school libraries today in Florida and Texas.
Well, and of course, in the 1970s, you start to see this groundswell of Arthurian stories told from different perspectives. Because, of course, Mary Stuart, with her 4 books that start the Crystal Cave, it's the Crystal Cave, the Hollow Hills, the Last Enchantment, and the Wicked Day. And those novels were written in the late 70s, and they're entirely from the point of view of Merlin. But this Merlin is the Merlin of Geoffrey of Monmouth's Vita Merlini. She uses Geoffrey of Monmouth as her starting point, And actually, the whole story in this has Arthur more as the chieftain king he might have originally been if he existed. And all of the issues are very much grounded in a sense of how the 5th or 6th century Arthur may have looked and felt, but it's all from Merlin's perspective. And not just as a sorcerer or somebody imbued with magic, but as a person and as somebody who himself was an illegitimate son.
Yes.
And dealing with that whole history. And I admit, that was my introduction to the Arthurian literature when I was 12. Yeah. I read all of those novels.
Let's pass over John Steinbeck's unfinished attempt to render Malory into modern English, The Acts of King Arthur and His Noble Knights. Neither of us have read it. I gave it a try, but life is too short. It's not really that good, and I think Steinbeck knew that because although he worked on it from November of 1956 to August of 1959, he never finished it. And that's another reason why we should be passing it over, because the last part of it is the story of Lancelot, and it breaks off before it gets to Lancelot's adultery with Guinevere. As I said, I wasn't really impressed with the parts of the Acts of King Arthur that I browsed. The 1976 Penguin edition, edited by Chase Houghton, helpfully includes excerpts from Steinbeck's letters relating to his work on this project. In the first of these letters, Steinbeck explained his goal. As he had been enthused by Malory when he was a boy, he wanted to provide the same experience to a new generation of children. But he knew that a stumbling block was Malory's sometimes obscure words and sentence structures. Steinbeck's modest goal was to remove that stumbling block by, in his words, quote, substituting known simple words and reversing sentences which even now are puzzling, end quote. And that's what he did. But in a way, I'm disappointed that he abandoned the project before tackling Lancelot's and Tristram's adulteries. As he said in that letter, there are things I will not do. I will not clean Malory up. Pendragon did take the wife of Cornwall, and that is the way it was. I think children not only understand these things, but accept them until they are confused by moralities which try to silence, to eliminate reality. These men had women, and I'm going to keep them, end quote. This was written in 1956, 15 years before Sutcliffe showed children a similar respect. In that last sentence, Steinbeck italicized women. His perspective was the male perspective. In another letter, Steinbeck announced what he took to be a breakthrough epiphany. All novelists use what he called a self-character with whom they identified. For Malory, that character was Lancelot, and I expect that Steinbeck himself identified with Lancelot. Steinbeck was not a stranger to adultery. He apparently wasn't personally confused by moralities which try to silence to eliminate reality. While he was married to his first wife, he was engaged in an affair with the younger woman who became his second wife. In his second wife's memoirs, published after Steinbeck's death, she described him as a serial womanizer. She recalls that on their wedding night, they were interrupted by a telephone call from his then mistress. The marriage didn't get better after that. His third wife was married when he began an affair with her. It would have been interesting to have read Steinbeck's take on Lancelot and Tristan. Much more to my liking is Thomas Berger's Arthur Rex, a legendary novel. And this will be the last novel we look at before turning to movies. Berger liked to play with genres and writing styles. What made his novels distinctive was his satirical and cynical sensibility. This is well illustrated by his best-known work, the revisionist Western Little Big Man, a picaresque novel whose unreliable narrator claims to be the only survivor of the Battle of Little Bighorn, which was turned into a really good film directed by Arthur Penn that starred Dustin Hoffman. Just as Little Big Man plays with the history and legends of the Old West, Arthur Rex does something similar with Malory. Burger follows Malory's structure and even stylistically mimics him, but Burger freely revises and reinterprets the legend throughout. The novel's tone is captured in its very last sentence. Arthur is being taken on a barge to the Isle of Avalon by three, in Burger's words, exemplary ladies. The quote, not-so-wicked Guinevere, the not-so-virtuous Morgan Le Fay, and the supernatural Lady of the Lake. But in these fair laps, Burger writes, quote, we must leave King Arthur, who was never historical, but everything he did was true, end quote. What attracted Burger to the Arthurian legend is what he saw as its central paradoxes. Genuine love leads to the dissolution of Arthur's household, and related to that, the ideals of Arthur's Round Table come into conflict and eventually lead to civil war and the deaths of all its knights. As Burger explains, quote, for this was the only time that a king had set out to rule on principles of absolute virtue, and to fight evil, and to champion the good. And though it was not the first time that a king fell out with his followers, it was unique in happening not by wicked design, but rather by the helpless accidents of fine men who meant well and who loved one another dearly, end quote. The review of the novel on the Bangor University's Malory's Followers website makes the interesting observation that Burger's female characters express this paradox most clearly. When Lancelot says that his war with Arthur is not the result of any hatred between the two, Guinevere thinks to herself, quote, nay, it hath happened because of men and their laws and their principles, end quote. In effect, she implies that idealism itself is responsible for many of the world's problems. This notion is really brought clearly into focus by Morgan Le Fay, Arthur's half-sister and his greatest nemesis. Throughout the novel, Morgan repeatedly seeks to undermine Arthur's kingdom by doing wicked things. Finally, however, Morgan enters the convent of the Little Sisters of Poverty and Pain, for after a long career in the service of evil, she comes to believe that corruption, quote, was sooner brought amongst humankind by the forces of virtue, and from this moment on, she was notable for her piety. That, I think, pretty much summarizes the sensibility of Arthur Rex. Now, Burger is a wise ass, and Burger he revels in ironies, and this is filled with irony. For example, Arthur pulls the sword from the stone, becomes king, and immediately discovers that now he's hedged in by all these rules, these laws, and he's lost all of his freedom. He hates the idea that he's becoming king because he no longer could do anything.
That's true. He's tied to his kingdom now.
When the wicked Sir Meligrand abandons his evil ways and embraces chivalry because he wants to be worthy of Guinevere's love, he turns into this bumbling fool who keeps on getting beaten up by various people until he finally dies at the hand of Lancelot. And as he's dying, he muses ruefully, this honor can be a taxing thing. So in this story, in Burger's story, and it's very much a 1970s take, Lancelot and Guinevere are basically self-absorbed.
Yes.
It's almost narcissistic. As in T.H. White, Burger's Lancelot, Guinevere, and Arthur truly love each other. But they are, each one of them, too lost in self to really understand what the others feel and think. In a wonderful scene, Arthur, Lancelot, and Guinevere sit silently together, each lost in his and her own thoughts. Quote, and each of these three great persons was utterly occupied with obsessions of self at this moment. For Lancelot could hardly restrain himself from confessing to King Arthur his loathsome sin against him and begging that he be put to death for it. And as for King Arthur, who believed Lancelot a blameless knight, he felt an almost irresistible urge to tell him of how he had fathered Mordred, whereas Guinevere considered whether she should not enclose herself in a nunnery, for she had known no peace for ever so long. End quote.
And again, it's very selfish. It's very self-absorbed.
It's also self-absorbed. Burger's Lancelot almost luxuriates in his guilt, exacerbated by his obsessive religious devotion, which Guinevere finds to be almost impossible to tolerate.
Yes, absolutely. Well, and what's interesting again, and I do want to make a small plug for another 70s adaptation.
Yeah?
Marion Zimmer Bradley's Miss of Avalon.
Yes.
Because Marion Zimmer Bradley does talk about the Lancelot-Guinevere affair, but her point of view is Morgan Le Fay. And she recasts the Arthurian story from the perspective of Morgan, from that one line in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight that refers to her as Morgan the goddess. And she takes the development of neo-paganism from the 70s and incorporates all the aspects of pre-Christian religion in Britain, in Ireland, into this amazing story that is a feminist approach. It
really is.
And even in those novels, Guinevere's problem is she's uptight. Guinevere's problem is she's too pious, too religious, too Christian, but also a hypocrite. But that doesn't necessarily make her at fault entirely. And so in the novel, while Morgan is the voice and Morgan is trying to defend her brother, the adultery is dealt with in a very, very different way because it's complicated. There are all of these complicated possibilities. Miss of Avalon was very important because it's the first time we hear from Morgan and her voice and her perspective, because in the medieval text, she's there. And in some of them, she's trying to stop her brother's court from destroying itself. And she sees Guinevere and Lancelot's love, and she keeps trying to go tell Arthur, hello, pay attention. And he's not. So Miss of Avalon really does capture that, and that was produced at the end of it.
In this episode, we focused on modern literary treatments of the Arthurian stories. But if you want a more realistic and gritty depiction of medieval adultery, you can find it in the first book in Sigrid Undset's Nobel Prize-winning trilogy about the life of an ordinary 14th-century Norwegian woman, Kristin Lavransdatter.
I have it. I just haven't read it.
I read this years ago, and I remember being impressed by its realism and also being sort of disoriented by its setting. It was not what I expected a medieval novel to be. This is not about castles and kings and great nobles. It's not even a saga. It's about an upper-class woman in rural Norway and her life. Undset published that first volume, it's entitled The Wreath, in 1920, and it was immediately acclaimed for its historical accuracy. Undset, the daughter of Norwegian archaeologists, spent 20 years researching medieval Scandinavia in preparation for writing the trilogy. The three novels demonstrate a mastery of the medieval sources, sagas, legal records, official documents, church liturgy, folklore, and ballads. She took pains to create a realistic world. Her goal, as she wrote in a letter when still a teenager, was to recreate the world she had encountered in the sagas, not in the manner of Scott, but realistically, so that, quote, everything that seems so romantic from here, murder, violent episodes, etc., becomes ordinary, comes to life, end quote. Kristin Lavransdatter and Undset's follow-on tetralogy, The Master of Hesviken, set in rural 12th century Norway, were early examples of this genre, the realistic historical novel, fictions in which the author attempts to understand the mindset of the period depicted. How successful she was in this is still a matter of academic debate. Virtually all critics acknowledge Undset's impressive knowledge of the sources and her power of description. In plain, spare prose, she depicts accurately and in detail the physical world of farm life in 14th century Norway. There is, however, ongoing debate whether the psychology of her characters, in particular Kristin, is medieval or Unset's own early 20th century Norwegian mentality made to look medieval. Unset herself rejected the assumed dichotomy. She believed that people in the past were fundamentally the same as in the present, with as complex and highly developed emotions as people today, especially in regard to spiritual needs and romantic passions. I'm not so sure about that. I agree that people of the past had full and complex emotional lives, but that doesn't mean that they thought the way that we do. In this episode, I'm only going to focus upon the treatment of adultery in Kristin Lavransdatter. Adultery plays a major role in the first of the three novels, The Wreath, which introduces the main characters. Kristin is the only surviving child of a prosperous and respected Norwegian landowner, Lavrans, hence the title, Kristin's Lavransdatter, and his wife, Rainfrid. She is their only surviving child. The couple lost 3 sons in infancy and Kristin's older sister in an accident. Rainfrid, throughout the first novel, is extremely depressed. At the end of the first novel, we learn that it's not only the death of her children that explains her depression. The marriage is not as happy as it appears to their neighbors, as it is darkened by a secret sin. Rainford had had sex with another man while betrothed to Lavrans. Lavrans preserved her reputation by marrying her, but he no longer loved her. A stern, traditional, and conventional man, Lavrans could neither forgive nor forget her transgression. Kristin grows up spoiled and pampered. She is attractive, intelligent, headstrong, and willful. And she defies her family in many ways. Her parents send her to a convent to await marriage. Her father has selected an appropriate husband for her, Simon Dar, whose father's lands lay adjacent to Lavrans. Kristin at first agrees. There's nothing that she doesn't like about Simon. He's okay. But while at the convent in Oslo, she meets Erland Nicholasson, a knight with a scandalous reputation who's attached to the king's court. At 18, Erland had run off with an older married woman, Eileen Ormsdatter, ultimately having 2 children by her and being forced to relinquish some of his lands in order to make amends with her relatives and the king. Erland meets Kristin in dramatic fashion, rescuing her and a fellow convent guest from an attempted rape while they're on a trip to town. Kristin recognizes Erland's name, as he is the nephew of a family friend, but his scandalous reputation, if she knows it, doesn't scare her off. She's immediately attracted to him, and he to her. In their first meeting, Erland is a complete gentleman. In their second, he seduces her, and they begin a clandestine affair. There are several impediments to their love. Kristin, after all, is betrothed to Simon, and that's nothing compared to Erland, who has both a live-in mistress and a discarded but living wife. Erland is even more a cad than Tennyson's Tristram. In Erland's first meeting with Kristin, he pledges to treat her honorably. In the second meeting, he seduces her. And then, finally, he impregnates her. He may perhaps be excused for starting an adulterous affair with Eileen Ormsdatter. He was only 18 at the time, and she was considerably older with an aged husband. Unset doesn't tell us, but it's possible that Eileen seduced the younger man. But once Erland took up with Kristin, Eileen became an obstacle to be removed, and this is done with poison. With the support of Kristin, and that's kind of shocking in itself, Erland brings his mistress a vial of poison and pretty much badgers her, forces her to commit suicide.
Ew.
To Lavrin's shame, Kristin now lives in sin with Erland. But after the death of Erland's wife from natural causes, Lavrans reluctantly gives his blessing to their marriage, at which point Kristin is already 3 months pregnant. Perhaps it's not surprising that Erland proves to be an unfaithful husband in the second and third books. Tristan finally has enough after Erlend's reckless political actions cost him his lands, and the two separate. In an instance of karma, Erlend returns to defend his wife against an accusation that she has committed adultery. He dies in the duel.
That sounds like a very happy novel altogether.
It's an incredibly unhappy novel.
I was going to say.
The father is...
Well, it's interesting that is the view, the early 20th century view of the 14th century, because, of course, one of the most common misconceptions is that, either you don't have sex or you have some kind of deviant sex. That's it. The adultery is a tragedy and all of this. Sex happens all the time in the Middle Ages, in a variety of ways.
Well, of course it happened in the 14th, or else you wouldn't have had the 15th century.
Well, there's that. But it's that kind of deep sense of tragedy with the sexual liaisons, that she's so good, she goes to a nunnery, then she's seduced, and she gets pregnant. And I think there's about 20 Midsummer Murders episodes that do that, but luckily in those, somebody dies.
Yes. I had hoped that Kat and I would wrap up this series on adultery in 3 episodes, but as we have run really long just talking about medieval adultery as presented in opera, in 19th century poetry, and in 20th century novels, we're going to leave the subject here, and Kat and I will come back for a 4th episode to talk about medieval adultery on film. Until then, bye for now.